Asterisk, asterisk. Here is the shocking truth most people learn too late. The day God begins removing a narcissist from your life, the narcissist does not lose you first. Asterisk, asterisk. They lose their access to the false world they built inside you. And when that access is cut off, something they have avoided their entire life begins to happen. They come face to face with reality. If you are listening today and you have survived a relationship that drained you, confused you, and kept you constantly explaining what should never have needed explanation, then hear this with a steady heart. God is not intimidated by manipulation. He is not dazzled by charm. He is not fooled by performance. And He does not abandon His people to psychological tyranny and spiritual distortion. For many believers, especially those who have carried decades of responsibility, marriage vows, family burdens, church commitments, and quiet endurance, this message is not entertainment. It is not gossip. It is not revenge. It is clarity. Because when God begins removing a narcissist from your life, He does not do it like humans do it. He does not remove them through drama. He does not need public humiliation to prove He is just. God removes through order. He removes through truth. He removes through the restoration of the human soul. And yes, because you asked for what so many viewers are too afraid to admit, they want justice. They want judgment. They want the moral scale to stop wobbling. They want evil to stop getting away with it. So let's speak plainly, but with reverence. God's justice is not a fantasy. It is a function of His nature. And when He begins removing a narcissist from your life, you are about to witness something both quiet and terrifying. The system that protected them begins to fail. God first withdraws His peace from the relationship. Most people assume God's removal begins with a sudden breakup, a shocking revelation, or a dramatic betrayal. But in many cases, especially for mature believers who have tried to make it work, who have prayed, counseled, forgiven, and endured, God begins in a way that is far more precise. He withdraws peace, not your temporary calm, not your ability to tolerate discomfort, not the numbness you develop to survive. I'm talking about the deep, steady peace that comes from alignment with truth, the peace that Scripture ties to a mind stayed on God. When you are bound to a narcissist, peace is often replaced by something counterfeit. The relief you feel when they're in a good mood, the calm you experience when you finally said the right words, the quiet that comes after you surrender your needs. But that is not peace. That is a ceasefire. And a ceasefire is not safety. It is simply a pause in war. When God begins removing a narcissist, the first thing He often does is remove the illusion that this relationship can be sustained by your effort. The internal warning system becomes impossible to ignore. The conversations feel heavier, the jokes feel sharper, the kindness feels strategic. You start feeling off, even when nothing obviously happened. You may try to reason it away. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I'm tired. Maybe I need to pray more. Unquote. But this is often how God protects His children. He makes the counterfeit unbearable. Because the narcissist's power depends on you doubting yourself. It depends on you normalizing the abnormal. It depends on you calling spiritual warfare marriage problems, calling control love, calling manipulation misunderstanding. And when God withdraws peace, He is not punishing you. He is waking you up. Many of you were raised to endure. You were taught to be loyal. You were taught to keep the family together. You were taught to be the bigger person. But God never asked you to become a permanent container for someone else's disorder. So the peace lifts, and with it, a question rises that you can no longer silence. Why does this require me to shrink, to survive? That question is not rebellion. It is discernment. And as the peace withdraws, your spirit begins to notice what your mind has been trained to excuse. You start seeing patterns. You start remembering moments you once dismissed. You start recognizing how often you are the one apologizing, even when you are the one harmed. And that is the beginning of removal. When peace departs, truth begins to reveal itself. The illusion starts to collapse. Once peace leaves, the next phase is not usually immediate freedom. It is something more uncomfortable. Reality begins to assert itself. Narcissistic relationships survive on illusion. Not always obvious lies, often emotional illusion. Illusion of mutuality, illusion of empathy, illusion of accountability, illusion that, this time, they truly understand. But when God begins removing them, the illusion cannot hold under the weight of truth. And truth has a particular sound. It is consistent. It does not shift with mood. It does not change when challenged. It does not require you to beg for clarity. Suddenly, you start noticing their stories don't match. Their apologies are vague. Their remorse has a schedule. Their affection appears right when you are about to leave. Their outrage appears right when you request basic respect. And you begin to understand something sobering. The relationship was not built on love. It was built on leverage. For many older believers, this collapse can feel like grief. You may grieve years. You may grieve a marriage you hoped would become holy. You may grieve the dream of growing old together in peace. You may grieve the version of them you kept alive in your mind. But here is a crucial spiritual truth. God is not cruel for allowing the illusion to collapse. He is merciful for refusing to let you keep living inside it. Because illusion is not neutral. It is a trap. It drains time, joy, and faith. It corrupts your sense of reality. It turns prayer into panic and love into self-erasure. This is why so many survivors feel like they lost themselves. It wasn't one moment. It was 1,000 small compromises, each one made to keep the illusion standing. But God does not build on illusion. He builds on rock. So he begins to dismantle the false structure you tried to sustain. And as it collapses, your conscience starts to awaken in ways you cannot reverse. You begin to feel a holy discomfort with what you once tolerated. You begin to feel grief, but also relief. You begin to see that your constant understanding was not maturity, it was captivity. And here is where justice begins to stir quietly. Because when illusion collapses, the narcissist loses their favorite weapon, plausible deniability. They can no longer hide behind confusion when you can finally name what you see. They may call you bitter. They may call you crazy. They may call you different lately. Create. But deep down, they sense the real shift. You are no longer hypnotized. And when that happens, they begin to panic, not always outwardly, but internally, because their control depended on your fog. And when light appears, your inner world can no longer remain still. Your conscience becomes louder than your attachment. This is one of the most sacred and most misunderstood parts of God's removal process. Your conscience gets stronger than your emotional bond. For years, many believers mistake attachment for covenant. They confuse trauma bonding with loyalty. They confuse pity with love, and they confuse endurance with godliness. But there comes a moment when your inner life begins to protest. Not because you want to punish them, not because you want revenge, but because your soul begins to recognize something you have been avoiding. Remaining requires you to betray yourself. And for a Christian, that betrayal is not just psychological, it is spiritual. Because God does not ask you to maintain relationship with lies. He does not ask you to participate in distortion. He does not ask you to keep calling darkness complicated. Your conscience becomes louder. You begin to feel conviction, not the kind that tells you to try harder, but the kind that says, this is not love. This is not safe. Desindiver. This is not fruit. This is not what God meant when He designed covenant. You may still feel tenderness. You may still remember the good moments. You may still hope they change. But now, your conscience places a boundary around your empathy. You stop making excuses that violate truth. And here is what mature believers often experience at this stage. You begin to realize that the biggest spiritual danger was not the narcissist's anger. It was your slow acceptance of what God never called normal. You accepted disrespect as stress. Ducumbly in the phosens. You accepted gaslighting as communication issues. You accepted emotional neglect as they're just different. You accepted spiritual manipulation as they're trying. But conscience is God's alarm system. And when it becomes louder than your attachment, it is often a sign that God is strengthening your inner spine. At this stage, many viewers want a particular kind of justice. They want the narcissist to finally feel what they caused. They want the narcissist to finally be exposed. But God often begins justice in a way that looks almost backwards. He begins by setting you free from the need to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. That is justice, too. Because the narcissist's favorite prison is this, keeping you explaining yourself to a wall. But conscience says, enough. And when your conscience rises, you start making decisions that are quiet but irreversible. You stop oversharing. You stop begging. You stop arguing with denial. You stop trying to earn basic respect. And the narcissist senses it immediately. Because your attachment was their supply. Your anxiety was their leverage. Your guilt was their tool. But now, conscience is breaking the tool in their hands. When conscience awakens, order begins to shift. God reorders power in the relationship. This is where many people misunderstand what God removing a narcissist actually looks like. It does not always look like them leaving first. It often looks like something more frightening to them. They are still present, but they are no longer powerful. The shift is not first external. It is internal. God begins to reorder power by restoring your clarity. You stop responding the way you used to. You stop reacting on cue. You stop collapsing into self-doubt whenever they push a button. And the narcissist, who has lived by managing perceptions, begins to experience something they cannot control. You are not afraid of their emotions anymore. That does not mean you become harsh. It means you become steady. A mature Christian steadiness is terrifying to a narcissist because it removes the drama they feed on. When you do not match their intensity, they cannot steer you. When you do not chase, they cannot reward you. When you do not panic, they cannot punish you. So power begins to reorder. You begin to see their tactics as tactics, not as truth. You begin to see their rage as strategy, not as authority. You begin to see their victimhood as manipulation, not as innocence. And here is where justice begins to take a sharper shape. Because God's justice often includes removing the narcissist's access to domination. They may still talk. They may still accuse. They may still threaten. But something about you has changed. You no longer treat their approval like oxygen. You no longer treat their moods like weather that controls your entire day. You no longer treat their opinion like the final verdict on reality. And when power shifts, you begin to live with a new internal statement. I answer to God, not to control. This reordering is not pride. It is restoration. Because the narcissist system required you to shrink, God's system requires you to stand. And when you stand, you will notice something that surprises many believers. The narcissist's confidence was never confidence. It was borrowed power from your fear. So when fear leaves, their power begins to evaporate. And God allows this not as spectacle, but as correction. He is not entertaining you with vengeance. He is restoring moral order. And when power changes direction, an inevitable reaction follows. The narcissist escalates or withdraws. When a narcissist begins to sense that control is slipping from their grasp, humility is almost never their first response. In fact, for most narcissists, the loss of control triggers the very behaviors they have relied on their entire lives to survive. They escalate. Escalation is not random emotion. It is strategy. They may escalate through sudden anger outbursts, designed to intimidate you back into compliance. They may escalate through silence withdrawal used as punishment rather than peace. They may escalate through smear campaigns, quietly shaping narratives so that, if you ever leave, you will look unstable or ungrateful. They may escalate by recruiting allies, family members, friends, church leaders, anyone who can be positioned as pressure against your discernment. And in deeply religious environments, they may escalate by becoming suddenly spiritual, quoting scripture, invoking God's name, or appealing to submission and forgiveness to shame you back into surrender. Or, when escalation fails to regain control, they withdraw, not with repentance, not with reflection, but with calculation. They withhold affection to create insecurity. They disappear to trigger fear. They threaten abandonment to restore leverage. They oscillate between distance and closeness, hoping to pull you back into emotional dependence. To the untrained eye, this looks like chaos, mood swings, confusion, contradiction. But spiritually, something far more precise is happening. It is the nervous system of manipulation, realizing it is no longer in charge. And this is often the stage where many viewers crave justice most intensely, because escalation hurts. It feels cruel. It feels deeply unfair. You are finally choosing health, truth, and alignment, and suddenly the pressure increases. The attacks sharpen. The accusations multiply. The atmosphere becomes hostile. But listen carefully, because this truth will steady you. When escalation happens, it does not mean you are doing something wrong. It often means the removal is working. The narcissist's tactics were carefully designed for the old version of you, the version who panicked when tension rose, apologized to restore peace, begged to be understood, explained yourself endlessly, and stayed even when your soul protested. But now something has changed. Your conscience is awake. Your peace has withdrawn from the illusion. Your internal alignment is stronger than your fear. And because their tactics no longer land the way they once did, the narcissist intensifies them. When that fails, withdrawal follows. Sometimes they withdraw to punish you, sometimes to bait you, sometimes to search for a new source of supply. And here is where God's judgment begins to press in, quietly but unmistakably. Because when their love disappears the moment control fails, it exposes what that love truly was. And for many narcissists, this exposure is unbearable, not because they suddenly experience true remorse, but because they cannot tolerate being seen even by themselves. So they may accuse you of changing. They may call you cold. They may say, "You're not the person I married." Bide. They may claim you've become distant, hardened, or unrecognizable, and in one sense, they are right. You are not the same person. But what they cannot say out loud is this: their system cannot survive without the old you. It cannot function without your confusion. It cannot operate without your guilt. It cannot feed without your emotional availability. At this stage, justice may not yet be visible to the public. There may be no exposure, no apology, no acknowledgement. But judgment has already begun in the one place the narcissist cannot manage, their inner world. They are forced to face a reality they have spent their lives avoiding, that they no longer have the power to make you small, and for a narcissist, that loss is seismic. This is why escalation or withdrawal often marks the final convulsion of control, not because they have changed, but because you have. And when control collapses, the relationship enters a new phase, not reconciliation, not repair, but separation. But that withdrawal is not the end, it is the beginning of sacred separation. Separation begins internally before it becomes physical. This is where God's removal becomes not only personal, but profoundly holy and unmistakably protective. Long before any door closes on the outside, before papers are signed, before vows are broken, before the final conversation is spoken aloud, before friends or family can fully comprehend what is happening, a separation takes place within you. This internal separation is quiet. There is no announcement, no dramatic declaration, no moment where the world stops and acknowledges what God is doing. Yet everything begins to change. You stop emotionally merging with them, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. You stop feeling responsible for regulating their moods, managing their reactions, or absorbing their instability so that peace can exist for a few fragile hours. You stop carrying their chaos as if it were your God-given assignment. For the first time in a long time, you lay down a burden that was never yours to bear. You begin to reclaim something sacred that has been held hostage often for years, sometimes for decades, your inner life with God. For many believers in midlife and beyond, this is the moment of sobering realization. You recognize how exhausted you truly are, not merely tired in body but depleted in spirit. You have been running on adrenaline for years. You have lived alert, watchful, hyper-aware. You have learned to anticipate moods before they arrive. You have memorized triggers. You have swallowed words that should have been spoken. You have prayed for peace, while quietly sacrificing your own. And then often without warning, something shifts. You feel something unfamiliar, quiet. Not the quiet of fear. Not the silence that follows an argument, not the uneasy calm that precedes another storm. This is a different kind of quiet, the quiet of detachment, the quiet that comes when your soul is no longer bracing for impact. You begin to see them as they truly are, not as you hoped they would become, not as you prayed they might change, not as the version you protected in your heart. And this seeing is not cruelty. It is not hardness, it is sobriety. Sobriety is the ability to perceive reality without illusion. And when God grants sobriety, it is always an act of mercy. This stage often brings grief, sometimes unexpectedly intense grief, because internal separation means you are not just letting go of a person, you are mourning a dream. You are releasing the fantasy of if only. Is of Amanis, if only they understood, if only they repented, if only they loved the way love was meant to be given. You grieve not what was, but what never truly existed. Yet even in grief, something sacred is happening. Because internal separation is also where your faith matures in a way that cannot be undone. You realize often for the first time with absolute certainty that obedience to God does not require agreement from the person who harmed you. You do not need their validation to stand in truth. You do not need their confession to justify your boundaries, and you do not need their apology to be free. This is a profound form of justice, because the narcissist's deepest offense was not only what they did to you, it was what they slowly trained you to believe about yourself. They trained you to believe that your peace depended on them, that your worth was negotiable, that your discernment was flawed, that your needs were excessive, That survival required self-erasure. Internal separation shatters that lie, and once that lie is broken, reconstruction begins. You begin to rebuild not hurriedly, not perfectly, but truthfully. Your sense of self, grounded again in reality rather than reaction. Your boundaries no longer defended with guilt. Your clarity no longer distorted by fear. Your prayer life restored from desperation to communion. Your ability to trust your own perception after years of doubting it. As this internal work completes, something surprising happens. Physical separation loses its drama. You are not leaving in rage. You are not fleeing in panic. You are not trying to prove a point. You are leaving in alignment. And for the narcissist, this is often far more devastating than confrontation. They wanted a scene. They wanted tears. They wanted begging. They wanted emotional chaos they could feed on, rewrite, or weaponize. But you leave with quiet certainty. No speeches. No performances. No explanations that invite debate. Just stillness. And that stillness, the kind that does not shake under pressure, is the unmistakable signature of God's hand at work. And when separation is complete, something far deeper emerges. Order is restored without you seeking justice. Now we arrive at the part many people whisper about, but rarely hear preached with clarity. You do not have to chase justice for God to deliver it. This is where the older believer finally exhales. Because by the time you reach your 40s, 50s, or 60s, life has taught you something painful but true. You do not have decades left to waste trying to win against someone who plays without conscience. You have already given years. You have already paid emotionally. You have already carried consequences that were never yours, and God knows that. So when He restores order, He does not require you to remain psychologically entangled, watching, monitoring, hoping for collapse, waiting for vindication, or replaying harm in your mind. God does not heal you by chaining you to the narcissist's downfall. Instead, He restores order by removing your participation in the disorder. Let this be said carefully, because it matters deeply. God's justice is not always loud. It is not always immediate. It is not always public. But it is always exact. When God begins removing a narcissist from your life, justice rarely arrives as spectacle. It arrives as structural losses that strike directly at the core of narcissism itself. Not punishment that feeds curiosity, not humiliation that entertains pain, but consequences that dismantle control. Justice begins to take shape like this. Loss of access to your attention, your reactions, your emotional energy, once their primary source of power. Loss of narrative control, because you are no longer defending yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. Loss of influence, because fear and guilt no longer steer your decisions. Loss of satisfaction, because their performances no longer wound you the way they once did. These losses may look subtle to outsiders, but to a narcissist, they are devastating, because narcissism does not survive on love. It survives on control. So hear this with sobriety, especially if part of you still longs for judgment to be unmistakable. For a narcissist, being unable to control the outcome is a form of judgment. Being unable to rewrite reality is a form of judgment. Being unable to pull you back into confusion is a form of judgment. When you are no longer available to manage their image, stabilize their emotions, or absorb their blame, something begins to happen that cannot be prevented. Their life starts to reveal what it truly is. Not because you are cursing them, not because you are plotting, not because you are retaliating, but because truth, over time, exposes what lies have been holding together. God restores order by restoring you. And once you are restored, once your clarity returns, once your peace is no longer negotiated, once your faith no longer requires self-erasure, the narcissist loses their primary supply, your collapse. They cannot feed on your exhaustion anymore. They cannot manipulate your conscience anymore. They cannot provoke the reactions that once kept them powerful. This is divine correction, and for those who need it, said even more plainly, yes, God judges evil. He does not ignore it. He does not minimize it. He does not call abuse a personality difference. Okay. He does not excuse cruelty as brokenness. He sees, he records, he responds. But his response is not always entertainment for the wounded. Sometimes his judgment comes as a holy separation, one so complete that returning becomes unthinkable. Because the greatest victory is not watching them suffer. The greatest victory is watching yourself become free. Free from vigilance. Free from self-doubt. Free from the constant need to explain what should never have needed explanation. And when order is restored, something shifts permanently in your spiritual life. You realize you were not discarded, you were delivered. You were not rejected, you were protected. You were not too much, you were simply no longer willing to be used. And that is why, when God begins removing a narcissist from your life, the ending is never about their feelings. It is about your restoration, your clarity, your peace, your faith, your future. Because God does not merely remove the enemy, He rebuilds the life the enemy tried to distort. And, when order is restored, you realize that being removed from their life was the very way you were saved.